The instructional strategy that we're going to focus on this module, the two actually are eliciting student thinking and building critical thinking. And you will see how these are really, they're twins. They work together. In the secondary classroom, this is essential for not only promoting social justice and equitable teaching practices, but also for keeping students engaged and ensuring that they are truly getting the readiness that they are going to need for their next level of learning or application, whether that be college, career, or both. So let's go ahead and jump in. Stephen Covey is well known for the book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Powerful Lessons in Personal Change. And there are many versions of it. You may have even read that one, or perhaps like the children's version or the teen version. But one of his most famous quotes, and it's one that is highly applicable to today's content, is most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. And I'm sure we can all relate to that. There are times where we are parts of conversations, and even if sometimes we're trying to focus on what the other person is saying, in our minds, we're thinking of how we're going to respond when we get an opportunity. Well, this actually works two ways in the classroom. We need to teach our students to be better listeners, but we also, as teachers, need to be better listeners. We cannot truly take in formative data and adapt instruction to meet those in-the-moment diagnostic needs of our students if we aren't really listening to them in order to check for understanding. And so that's what we're going to do today, is figure out how can we design lessons, how can we structure our, how can we scaffold our questioning in such a way that our students are engaging with the content, but we are leveraging it in a way that their critical thinking is becoming enhanced as the lesson progresses. And we can listen to help refine their understanding through each step of the process. So what is eliciting student thinking? Teachers pose questions that create space for students to share their thinking about specific academic content. They seek to understand student thinking, including novel points of view, new ideas, ways of thinking, or alternative conceptions. So we need to look at how to do this. Teachers draw out student thinking through carefully chosen questions and tasks and attend closely to what students do and say. They consider and check alternative interpretations of student ideas and methods, and they're attentive to how students might hear their questions and to how students communicate their own thinking. Teachers use what they learn about students to guide instructional decisions and to surface ideas that will benefit other students. And so, yes, we need to arrive at the lesson. So in the classroom, we already need those prepared strategies. So we really need to think deeply about our content, and we need to try to match it to our learner profiles. And we need to have those questions prepared in advance. They should be built into the lesson. At the same time, what these instructions are telling us is that we need to be listening to the responses that our students are giving us, so that we can adapt our instruction to refine their understanding of the content. So let's look at this quote by the Dalai Lama. When you talk, you are only repeating what you already know. But if you listen, you may learn something new. And we see this a lot in the classroom. Students have a tendency to parrot other students, or they have a tendency to parrot what they think the teacher wants them to say. And if we can be better listeners and teach them to be active listeners, this is when we can arrive collectively as a learning community to some of those higher levels of understanding. So how do we do this? By eliciting and interpreting student thinking, we as teachers position students to become the sense makers. And essentially what happens is the learning centers around their thinking, which validates their thinking in the classroom and allows them to feel like valuable members of the learning community. Their thinking is making key contributions which help everyone learn together. So let's talk about how eliciting student thinking actually advances social justice. At the heart of eliciting and interpreting student thinking is the fundamental commitment to students and their ideas, to the belief that students are smart, and to the fact that uncovering and supporting their thinking is the goal of teaching. When teachers learn about students' ways of thinking and how they communicate ideas, they signal to students that they are knowledgeable and that their ideas are interesting and valued. However, this practice does have risks. Patterns of bias related to race, gender, and other social identities, as well as stereotypes about subject matter competence, can easily misshape teachers' interpretations of students. Skillful eliciting and interpreting can intervene on these biases by enabling teachers to learn about student ideas and challenge false assumptions about students' lack of competence. When teachers understand and appreciate students' thinking, they are better able to support students to contribute in class and to position them as capable among their peers. So when we're talking about checking biases, this is something that we model as teachers. And then, of course, we create that classroom culture to where we want our students to check their biases. So for example, this is where we want to lay aside any stereotypes that we would have about what our students would know or not know, or perhaps what they would value or not value. Sometimes that determines the nature of questions that we give them. For example, I was recently observing a class and the teacher only posed what we call level 1 questions. So we'll talk about this in a moment when we're talking about leveling questions. She only posed the entire class period. It was level 1 questions. So everything for the students was very easy. And when we talked about that in her post conference, she said, well, some of them are kind of what we consider low learners. Their test scores aren't great, and they don't seem to engage very much in class. So we were able to have a great conversation about how perhaps it's because they aren't given the opportunity. So we talked about, yes, she needed to start with a really firm foundation of those level 1 questions, but just like climbing a ladder, she needed to begin implementing those more challenging questions that allow the students to engage in deeper critical thinking. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about teaching for equity. Are we giving all of our students an opportunity to think critically and to process deeply? Or is it only our students who are sitting in advanced classes? And that's something that we need to be very careful of as teachers, is that we're giving our students opportunities to think deeply and critically about their learning. These next few slides are a framework for how to strategize your questioning. I've put them on these slides and I am going to go through them fairly quickly, but don't worry, within Moodle, I've also put the PDF so that you can easily click on this, pull it up, and look at it for yourself. But we're just going to go over a couple of the basic strategies. So when we're talking about formulating and posing questions, we want to design them to elicit and probe student thinking with sensitivity to how students might hear or respond to the questions. So look at some of these bullet points. We want to have some general open-ended questions. We want to use native language when possible to pose the questions. Of course, that's not going to always be possible in your classes, but translation support is important. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later about how we can make sure we're getting the proper tools to help our students engage. Make sure that the pace of the questioning is slow enough, and that we're using repetition and that we're actually leveling the prompts, which we'll talk about in a moment, so that students have time to process the questions, so that they have time to develop an adequate response. We want to use gestures, visuals, what we call leveled sentence stems, as needed to support the questioning and allow them to develop an adequate response. Choosing areas of the student's expressed thinking or work to focus on and developing appropriate questions. So this has to do with learner interest and developing hypotheses to test about the student's thinking. And this, that when we talk about developing hypotheses to test about their student thinking, sometimes these are what we call those guiding questions. We're just kind of testing the waters of what they know. We want to pose questions that are culturally relevant and to draw on the particular experiences and background knowledge of the learner. So when possible, we constantly want to make connections to something that they can relate to, and allowing students to communicate in their preferred mode, drawing, writing, speaking, etc. Again, I want to reference a recent example. One of the teachers I observed had no opportunities built into her class for students to communicate with each other the entire class period. And she was a little bit disappointed that there were two teenage girls in the back who during her lesson would occasionally talk to one another. They truly weren't misbehaving. They were simply having a side conversation. And it really bothered her that they were doing that. So we had a great conversation about, was it realistic to think that two teenage girls who were friends could go an entire 50-minute class period without speaking at all? And she said no. She agreed that that was not realistic. And so we looked at her lesson and we talked about, well, if we know that speaking is one of their preferred styles of engagement, they love to speak, are we building in time in the classroom for them to have conversations that are meaningful about the content that they're learning? And she had not. And so that's an easy thing to do, is figure out how do they like to communicate. Most teenagers actually enjoy speaking if we create a safe space for them. They love talking with their friends or a small group. They do enjoy creative modes, so drawing or illustrating. We know that they enjoy engaging with technology. So when we can pull that in as a piece for them to engage in questioning, that's always good. So we want to keep these things in mind. Remember that listening is a key part, and we want to make sure that we're interpreting their responses in a way that is truly instructionally responsive. Again, we want to give them plenty of time to formulate their answers and to speak. And sometimes this can be painful, especially when students are having trouble formulating their ideas. But you as the teacher need to be patient. Give them time to form those ideas. We want to allow supportive, what's called thinking time, for them to interact with a peer, to draw, to write, so that they can actually practice the language to develop their response. We want to pay close attention to what the student says without unnecessary interruptions. So this means that as students are formulating their answers, as much as possible, withhold your comments, perhaps only to guide or to refine. And we also want to create that space within our classrooms that is respectful, so that when someone is speaking, we want to make sure that everyone is listening. This allows the students to get the message that what we have to say is valuable. Listening for ideas rather than academic language. So this means that there are times when the students are not going to use the academic language correctly, but we want to actually listen for what they're saying, because many times their processes and their conceptualizations are correct. It's just a language issue. And it's great when you can pick up on that and give them the academic language to support what they're saying, of course, after they've said it. Noticing specific features of the student's thinking. So look for common patterns, strengths, strategies, novel ideas, areas of particular interest or engagement, weaknesses, errors. This is individually, and this is also collectively within your group. Use knowledge of the students to make sense of their responses. And so this means it's important to know your students. Many times their perspectives are going to come through in the way that they respond. And so it's important to understand the frame of reference that they are going to be coming from. Purposefully connecting the particular background knowledge or experience that the students to the content is important. And listening for specific evidence of English language development. This has to do with your English language learners, but I would advocate that it has to do with all of your learners. We want to teach all of our students to speak correctly. Don't overly correct their grammar because then they're not going to feel confident. So it has more to do with the articulation of their ideas. As we move through those questioning prompts, we want to develop additional questions, prompts, and tasks that probe and actually unpack what the students say. So some tips are identifying elements of the student's thinking that he or she has said little about and probing further. Of course, we want to be sensitive, so this is not something necessarily that we want to do about their personal lives, but typically it has to do with drawing out their thinking a little bit more. Many times we're going to ask them, how did you know that? Or what evidence did you use to arrive at that? So we're keeping it content focused. Identifying particularly interesting or confusing to the teacher aspects of the student's thinking and developing corresponding questions or prompts. And so this can be done very easily. So if something is really interesting, you're going around the classroom and you hear something really interesting or maybe even confusing, ask the students to clarify that for you, clarify your understanding. Focusing on a particular strategic aspect of the student's thinking to probe further. So for example, a good starting point for the student, something he or she needs to work on or develop more. So we want to allow our students to become really cognizant of their own thinking. And so we want to teach them some metacognitive strategies. So for example, using language like that is an excellent starting point to answering this question is a clue to let them know you're on the right track, keep going. Or when you say something that says like they need more work to develop it more, we want to actually, if possible, give them some specific academic guidance. So if you're trying to strengthen a student's ability to develop, let's say, a problem more, you're in math, you would maybe want to give them and say, have you tried the such and such formula to solve this? So you're not giving them the total answer. You're saying, yes, you're on the right track, but try an alternative to develop it a bit more. Developing additional questions that are attuned to the student's English language learning. Of course, this has to do with your ELL students. And these also have to do with your ELL students and your bilingual students, giving them the opportunity to express it in their native language first. And this is something that we really need to work on with those populations. And then questioning and probing emergent bilinguals with the same high expectations for all students, knowing that more planning and support may be needed. So essentially what we're saying here is don't water it down just because they may not speak our native language. They still can learn and interact with high-level content. We just have to bridge that language gap for them, which fortunately in our area, we are becoming better and better with our ESL strategies and coaching to support those English language learners. This is the content and practices model, and it's by TeacherWorks. And this graphic really helps us understand the way that the eliciting student thinking works, the process that we go through. So if we look on the far left-hand side, we formulate questions designed to elicit and probe student thinking. So now it's going to enter this cycle. We pose the question to the student, and then as the cycle, notice how it goes around, we're listening and interpreting. The child is listening and interpreting, and the teacher is listening and interpreting. And as we go around this model, as needed, we develop additional questions that will help the student refine their understanding. We also teach our students to develop their own questions to refine their understanding. We might need to go around the cycle again, pose another question, listen and interpret, develop additional questions. Notice that as this goes over on the right-hand side, what we're doing at the heart of this cycle is we are making sense of what students know and can do. And so as teachers, what we end up with is some really valuable, typically formative data that we are using to refine the questions, refine the tasks, so that students are constantly leveraged in their critical thinking. So we want to stop just a moment and plug into how this connects to our work. We want to be thinking about our planning. So our midterm exam, and what we're going to actually jump into the next module, is to begin to develop a lesson plan. And we want to think about the role that eliciting student thinking, particularly through questioning, plays a role in the accomplishment of strong student outcomes. We want to think about what that's going to look like in the classroom. How are we going to execute that in the classroom? And we want to think about reflecting over our class. And this, of course, is going to be not only in our midterm, but it's also going to be in the field when you get in the field. What does our student work look like? What do these student questions sound like? When students are asking me questions that need refinement, what are they particularly needing? And what are some of their areas of struggle? How am I going to leverage their learning? And when I say leverage, we want to think about, again, like a ladder, a scaffold that we put in place to take them from lower level learning to higher level learning. How are we going to iron out those misconceptions? So I just wanted to kind of stop and take a moment so that we could understand how this plays a role in our planning and in our instruction. One way that we can structure that scaffolding and plan for higher levels of student learning is through what's called Webb's depth of knowledge. I've put several resources for you on Moodle. Some of them are some PDFs that are going to have some of these charts on them that you can easily access. And then there's also a really great video with a sample of, I think it's a social studies sample of the Gettysburg Address, of how we leverage students' learning through what's called the depth of knowledge wheel. Level 1 is what we call recall. And notice at the center of this is describe, explain, and interpret. And this is what we want students to be able to do. And at level 1, which is what we call the recall level, look at what we're asking students to do. So list, identify, define. Sometimes we're asking them to recall. Do they know what happened? Sometimes recite. If it's something that we need them to know by memory in order to move forward. Tabulate, name. So name is often used in our science classes. We need them to identify some sort of basic, what we call that introductory knowledge that they're going to need to begin doing more advanced concepts. As we move to level 2, this is where we begin to get into that conceptualization. This is where we begin building skills. So notice here, this is where we get words like graph, classify, separate, cause effect, estimate. Notice that students are actually doing something. They're applying what they've learned in level 1 to create new meaning. They're interpreting. They're using context clues. So at this point, it's not just that they're defining the vocabulary word, they're actually using the cues, in the text to develop their own understanding of words. When we talk about summarizing, they're not simply recalling or telling what happened here. They're highlighting the key events of something that was typically a longer process or something that was chronological. And they have to determine what are the key ideas that I need to know about this. So it's a little bit more advanced. As we move around the wheel, this is where we get level 3, which is called strategic thinking. Notice what we're asking students to do here. We're asking them to assess something. So now that they understand the language and they've been applying it, they understand that there are some particular criteria so that they can know if they're on the right track or not. They're having to make some comparisons. At this point, we're asking them where it says cite evidence and draw conclusions. These kind of go hand in hand. At this point, they are arriving at some of their own ideas, and we're asking them to use evidence from the text, from maybe a lab, from a math problem, from a word problem or something, and they're having to support their decision making with evidence from the text. Notice here they're also having to develop a logical argument. All of these go together. As we move around to level 4, this is what's called extended thinking. This is where we are asking students to do some pretty advanced things with what they've learned. So now we are asking them to prove. And typically when we say prove, there are multiple steps involved in a prove. They not only have to understand the language, be able to do something with it, be able to cite evidence, but now they're going to have to provide it in such a substantial way using a particular persuasive method that they are proving it. They're going to create something. So now it's going to be something original. They have conceptualized their understanding to the point that they can adapt it to a new situation and create something original. When we're talking about analyzing, this means that if we're talking about, let's say, a piece of text, the students can break that text down into literary elements, such as characterization, setting, figurative language. They can break it into its component parts. They can provide evidence for each one of those parts, and then they explain how those parts work together to create a common theme within the work. So this is a very advanced thing that we ask students to do. We could go on here with these verbs, but I think you get the point of what depth of knowledge is and how it works. These are also provided for you on the Moodle in a PDF, but I wanted to show them to you. These are the depth of knowledge question stems. And so when we look at the wheel, it tells us what students are supposed to do, but this tells us how we as teachers can pose questions in such a way that scaffold our students' learning and allow them to do that. So take a moment. You can actually pause your screen, pause this presentation, and just browse. Look at what level 1 is, and then look at how it grows to level 2 and what we're asking students to do in each one. Again, take a moment and pause the screen. Look at level 3 questions and how they're growing with what we're asking students to do and be able to apply with their knowledge. Look what we're asking them to do in level 4. The depth of knowledge question stems that I showed you are applicable for all content areas, but if you look at the effective questionings packet that's on Moodle, there are actually some that are broken down by content area. Those are very valuable for our high school classrooms that are so content specific. So let's talk about when we teach our students. We want to ask questions, and how to ask the right question or a good question can actually empower our students with the ability to get the information that they need to be successful. And it's not only getting the information, but it's modeling what we do when we pose those questions and we allow our students to work through that learning process, is we are implicitly teaching the skill of how to critically think. Bloom's taxonomy actually can work hand in hand with the depth of knowledge wheel. They do not compete. They actually support one another, so don't be confused by that. But Bloom's taxonomy, which I'm sure you've heard about several times now, this is the revised version. It underwent a slight revision, which it wasn't that big of a change actually. But right here between analyze and evaluate, we used to have what was called synthesize. But that you might see that sometimes on other documents. Don't be confused. It's the same thing. This is just a slight revision. So we start at the bottom. It is a hierarchy. The taxonomy is a hierarchy, and we work up. And that's why when we talk about scaffolding, we often use the language of ascension. And that's what's happening. We are actually asking students to think at a higher level. So instead of just recognizing and recalling facts, which is important, and notice it's a broad base here because that's where we have to start. Then we ask them to do things that demonstrate their understanding of what these facts actually mean. As we work up, we begin asking them to apply the facts and the rules, the concepts, or the ideas. Then we ask them to break down that information into its component parts. Then we ask them to judge the value of the information or the ideas. And lastly, we ask them to combine the parts to make a new whole. And that's where we get to the creation part. Synthesize was right here between analyze and evaluate. And synthesize was actually very similar to what we asked students to do for creation, which is why they made that change. Students are actually having to take information from multiple sources and do some joining, so to speak, or some synthesis of it to arrive at a new idea or a new concept. And so that's why they create was the change that was made. So in this next slide, in the next few slides, I want you to do the same thing that you did for the depth of knowledge. You're going to pause the screen, pause your program, and I want you to just take a moment to look at what is a level 1 and what are we asking students to do at that level 2. And notice how these question stems are formulated to help students get there, to get to that next level. So yes, we always want to start with those level 1 questions, but we don't want to keep them there. We want to move them to the higher thinking processes. So go ahead and take a moment, pause your screen. You can pause your screen for this one as well. And once again, look at what are we asking students to do at a level 3 and how do we move them to the level 4. Again, you can pause your screen, and this is the last one for Bloom's. Look at what we're asking students to do at a level 5. And again, how do we push them to that level 6? Another technique for questioning can be what's called the 5 W's or the 5W and an H. And it's another way that we can develop independent questioning within our students. So 5 W's, also known as the 5 W's and H, is a concept that's used in journalism, research, and any basic investigation or interrogation of evidence. Most consider this approach as fundamental when examining any new learning situation. It is a formula for developing speculative thinking and establishing all that we can deduce from the evidence that we have. So we want to think about, are we looking at a text? Are we looking at a story, an image, a film, a sound, a conversation, a lab. The maxim of the 5 W's and 1 H is that any analysis of basic facts and information is only complete when we can answer a checklist of 6 questions, each of which comprises an interrogative word: who, what, when, where, why, how. The principle underlying the maxim is that each question should elicit a factual answer, facts that are necessary to include for a report or when learning can be considered complete. Importantly, none of these questions can be answered with a simple yes or no. This approach models simple, good thinking, and it is important for children to develop a disposition of self-questioning starting with this set. So this is a great place to start with students, teaching them how to question themselves. So so that they can design questions which allow them to critically think about their learning. Another strategy is called the "in what way might." So this stage is crucial if the facts are to come alive, engage all students in the thinking, and contribute to an effective, creative thinking process. You may well need to link these questions to the Bloom's taxonomy if you want to achieve the correct level of challenge, or use the "in what might, sorry, it's difficult to say. So notice on the left, we have the who, what, why, when, where, how, but we've added this one question here: in what might. It's so hard to say, I'm sorry. So look at the examples, and it shows you once students have the basic facts, if we add this one stem, what we're getting them to do is to think more creatively, to be innovative with their understanding, and sometimes to draw conclusions based on evidence. These strategies for questioning and implementing questioning in your classroom are all provided on the Moodle site in PDFs, but I just wanted to take a little bit of time to kind of go through what you have, what resources are available to you there. So on the left-hand side, you're going to see the column that has the strategy and the approach. The middle is going to give you a process for how to do it. And then the far right-hand side helps you see the gain or the benefit to your lesson and your student outcomes. So for example, one of them is, which is so important, is called thinking time. So we consciously give what's called wait time for the class to think through an answer. You've posed a question, let's make sure we give them enough time. So before you break the silence, and typically 15 to 30 seconds is adequate, depending on the level of question that you've asked them. The process is we want to provide time between setting the question and requiring an answer. Sometimes we want to alert pupils to the approach and the time available to develop an answer. And what this means is before you pose a really high-level thinking question, let the students know, okay guys, I'm going to give you approximately 15 seconds so that you can think about your response. So don't immediately shoot your hand up. I'm not going to call on you at that time. I want you to give yourself time to process this question, then pose the high-level question, and then actually give them the time. So the benefit is that this prompts the depth of thought, and it increases the level of challenge. It ensures that all pupils have a view or an opinion to share before the teacher is requiring an answer. And sometimes you may even want your students to record that answer. You might want to give them a space to put the answer down so that they can kind of get their thoughts together before they share out. So if you look on the left-hand side, these are some great strategies to build in, and kind of move across the chart and it'll explain it for you and the benefits and the gains that you can get from those. So pause the screen and take a moment and read over those. Once again, you want to take a moment to pause the screen, read over the strategies and how you implement it in a classroom through the process and what you can gain from it. There are some really great ones here. The phone a friend and the pair rehearsal. These are all things that are very instrumental. I recommend that you pause your screen so that you can take a moment to look at these strategies as well. Notice that staging or sequencing, this means that we use questions with increasing levels of challenge, is an important strategy that we can use to help scaffold students' learning. And then the big questions, the setting of a substantial and thought-provoking question, this is always pretty important as well. These are very open-ended. So I'm just going to let you pause and take a moment to look at the strategies, the processes, and then the gains and benefits for using each one. These can really stimulate your thinking about how you can implement questioning strategies into your lesson plans. Again, I'm going to give you time to pause and look at these. So at the heart of eliciting student thinking, and we went through several different strategies that we can use to use questioning techniques to stimulate student thinking. At the heart of that, what we're really trying to get students to do is to develop their critical thinking skills. So let's jump into talking about critical thinking. Critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. In order to reach these critical thinking processes, you must first ask the right questions. These questions can help you assess both the meaning and the significance of claims and arguments. Building these skills and applying them in your life makes it easier for you to assess evidence. And so this is something that we have to continually model for students. We have to build lesson plans that give them opportunities to develop these critical thinking skills. And we also want to help them build their own skills so that they can acquire lifelong learning critical thinking skills. So let's talk about what critical thinking is. Critical thinking is that mode of thinking about any subject, content, or problem in which the thinker improves the quality of his or her thinking by skillfully taking charge of the structures inherent in thinking and imposing intellectual standards upon them. So we carefully consider what the problem is. We give ourselves time, space, and resources in order to consider it or to think about it. And then we can arrive at some sort of solution. And one of the things that we teach students is that there are some problems that have multiple solutions. And there are some that, in fact, don't actually have any solutions. But it is that level of critical thinking that helps us arrive at either one of those alternatives to a solution. So you'll notice on the left that what I've given you is kind of a capsulation of Bloom's taxonomy. So this is sort of like another graphic aid representing it. But as you look at this on the left, I want us to review on the right, what are the qualities of a critical thinker? What does a critical thinker look like in action? So a critical thinker raises vital questions and problems, formulating them clearly and precisely. A critical thinker gathers and assesses relevant information using abstract ideas to interpret it effectively, comes to well-reasoned conclusions and solutions, testing them against relevant criteria and standards. A critical thinker thinks open-mindedly within alternative systems of thought, recognizing and assessing as needs be their assumptions, implications, and practical consequences. And a critical thinker communicates effectively with others in figuring out solutions to complex problems. So a critical thinker is not afraid to engage with the skills that it takes to be resourceful, to be a problem solver, to use the available data to generate relevant questions that can lead to higher understanding. So this is something that I want us to consider. It's a statistic by Educational Measurement, which is an academic journal. And there is an entire study on this if you're interested in it. But essentially, through multiple means of measurement, they deduced that approximately 45% of college students lack critical thinking skills. 45%, that's almost half of college students. So we're not talking about high school students, middle schoolers, elementary school students. 45% of college students lack critical thinking skills. So we want to think about the implications for that. Are they not capable of developing those skills? Or have they never been given the opportunity to develop those skills? And so when we talk about implementing practices that make teaching more equitable so that everyone has access to high quality education, this is what we're talking about. Making sure that when students enter college classrooms that they have had the practice of developing the necessary critical thinking skills it will take to be successful at that level and beyond. And so this is a statistic I want to bring up to you simply because as secondary teachers, it's something that we need to be very aware of. We must do what it takes to stretch our students. They are capable, they can do it, they just need to be given the opportunities, and they need the scaffolding of proper questioning and lesson plans so that they can reach those higher levels of critical thinking. Now, can we develop critical thinkers that have parallel thinking? So let's actually talk about what this means. Can we get our students to critically think about content and parallel think? So parallel thinking is where each thinker puts forward his or her thoughts in parallel with the thoughts of others, not attacking the thoughts of others. So many times this is where we begin to engage in conversations about civil discourse. What does it look like in your content area to develop critical thinkers? In some of our social studies and English classes, many times we are talking about themes that can be polarizing. When we get into some sort of political conversations, or sometimes when we get into specific studies with, that reference particular values or life experiences, we have to be able to teach our students to engage in these kind of discussions that stretch their critical thinking in a way that is sensitive to the needs of others and that doesn't attack others. The same thing can actually happen in science and math classrooms. They can actually happen in any classrooms. So we have to teach our students how to properly parallel think and engage in critical thinking. One way that we can do that is by teaching our students about the 6 thinking hats. And this is one strategy that you can use to get students to understand multiple perspectives. So this is the work of Edward de Bono, and the thinking hats are color-coded, which we all love color codes. And we're going to jump into talking about what this work is and how the 6 thinking hats can help our students critically think and think about multiple perspectives in a way that also allows them to parallel think. So the 6 thinking hats approach encourages parallel thinking. And you can see on the left, we have this really excellent photograph of how it was implemented in a classroom. In traditional adversarial thinking, A and B are in conflict. Each side seeks to criticize the other point of view. The 6 hats method allows parallel thinking. Both A and B wear each hat together as they explore all sides of an issue. Adversarial confrontation is replaced by a cooperative exploration of the subject. So the 6 hats widen our lens. 6 colors of hats for 6 types of thinking. Each hat identifies a type of thinking, and the hats are directions that guide our thinking. The hats help a group use parallel thinking, so you can theoretically put on and take off a hat. And I've actually included a video of elementary school students who are engaging in this practice. They use stuffed animals that have this color hat. I've seen it in classrooms, in high school classrooms, where teachers actually put students in small groups, and she has purchased these colors hats, similar to what you saw in the photograph in one of the previous slides. They were kind of like the little Party City or dollar store colored hats. But let's just talk a little bit. We're going to go delve into more of these colors, but on the left you can see the hats, the colors of the hats correspond with the type of thinking that those hats are representative of. So let's take a moment and look at the hats. So the white hat is considered the objective facts and figures. This one is concerned with data and information. The red hat is considered the emotional hat. This one is concerned with feelings, intuition, those gut feelings or hunches that people have. The black hat is considered the more cautious hat. This one is concerned with caution, critical judgment. This one is considered almost as a preventative type hat, like the what could happen kind of hat. The yellow hat is the one that we associate with benefits. So this one is hopeful, it is positive and beneficial. And so it's kind of the inverse of the black one. It's sort of the what could go wrong hat. This one is optimistic, sunny, and it's considered the logical positive. The green hat is the one that's associated with ideas. So this one is associated with creativity. This one has lots of lateral thinking strategies built into it. It's associated with energy, fertility, growth. So this one is interested in innovation, and it switches around the normal superiority of the black hat. Blue is concerned with planning. This one is considered the process control. This one is the organization hat. From start to finish, how is something going to be executed? It controls the use of the other hats. So this one is the thinking about our thinking hat. And then I have personally never seen this one used, but I've read about it. And it is called the purple hat. And this one is the invested. So it's considered the royal hat. This one is committed and invested. This one is subjectively seeking objectivity. And essentially, from my understanding, this hat is the one that is the natural perspective of the individual doing the thinking. The benefits of using the 6 thinking hats are that it provides a common language, it provides experience and intelligence opportunities for each person to express diversity of thought. We use more of our brains when we engage in this type of thinking. It helps people work against type and preference. And so this can be really excellent for those students who have trouble seeing other points of view, or perhaps who are a bit stubborn in their viewpoints, which, believe it or not, we get quite a bit of that in high school. It allows us to remove our egos. So we reduce confrontation when this happens. It allows us to save time, focusing on one thing at a time. And we can create, evaluate, and implement action plans based on our findings from the 6 thinking hats. So let's start with the blue hat. The blue hat allows us to reflect on the thinking about our thinking. It also, the wearer of the blue hat can also point out thinking of the other hat's thinking. So this is sort of the metacognitive hat. It provides instructions for the thinking. It controls the organization of the way that the hats interact with their thinking. It is in control of the other hats. So this one is responsible for the discipline and the focus of the discussion that partakes between the other hats. So the blue hat, often we think of that as the controller hat. In this role, the controller hat takes full control of the thinking and the actual process. This doesn't mean that teachers do not provide the blue hat with steps and perhaps a model in the beginning for how to do it. But ultimately, when students feel comfortable putting on that blue hat, they're in control. They're kind of like the moderator. They begin and end the session with the blue hat. They are the facilitator. They are in the session leader's role. And what we often see with the choreography is the open, the sequence for events and the thinking, and the close are things that they're responsible for. Part of the way that they focus is they remind us of what we should be thinking about. So it kind of helps us stay on track. They are responsible for asking critical questions. These can be prepared in advance, and they can also be prepared in the moment. They help define and clarify the problem, and they help set the thinking tasks. With the blue hat, the student would say things sort of like why we are here, what we want to be talking about, help define the situation or the problem, help provide alternative definitions, specifically of key terms. They remind and clarify what the group discussion wants to achieve. They are responsible for sort of summing up where the discussion ends up. They provide any background that is necessary for the thinking, and they provide a plan for the sequence of hats. And so that the wearing of the hats doesn't have to be rigid. The students can actually exchange hats in this process. The blue hat is responsible for closing by reminding the group of what they have achieved, what were the outcomes, the conclusions, and then they also are responsible for kind of laying out what solutions are possible or have been arrived at and what the next steps are for students to consider, whether it be in the discussion or whether it be individually. The white hat is the neutral objective information hat. This one is responsible for facts and figures. The white hat reviews all of the existing information. It looks for gaps in any of the data, and it looks for trends. Some of the questions that the white hat considers is, what information do we have? What do we need? What information is missing? What questions do we need to ask about this data? Is this fact or is this belief? And so whoever is wearing the white hat has to be very cognizant of, is this supported by empirical evidence and data, or is this something that is value driven or value laden, opinion laden? It excludes opinions, hunches, and judgments, and it removes feelings and impressions from its thinking. So it's only looking at the facts. The white hat questions at right, and look at the graphic on the left, really helps you understand the thinking process of the white hat. They're concerned with, what information do we have? What do we need? Is there something missing? Particularly, they're concerned with isolating facts. So very concerned with data, but that doesn't mean that they can't look at the nature of the data or the quality of the data. So for example, the white hat also needs to be skilled at looking at sources. Just because data says a certain thing doesn't mean that it may not have bias. So that's also something they have to consider. The red hat is the emotional hat. This one is concerned with hunches and feelings, intuitions, gut instinct. It doesn't have to be logical. It doesn't have to be consistent even. So there doesn't have to be a justification or a reason or a basis for this. This considers how other people will react emotionally. Okay, so it's almost the opposite of the white hat, so to speak. The red hat, and if we look again at the graphic of the thinking process of the red hat, These are some questions. What is your gut reaction to this plan? What's your opinion? What do you like or not like? What emotions are involved with the constituents of this issue? Fear, anger, hatred, suspicion, enthusiasm. How do you think our staff, and so this is where it uses the word staff here, but any stakeholder in a specific issue, how do each of them feel in this situation? The yellow hat is considered the positive hat. So this one is the logical positive. So this one is looking at the positive side of things. It is speculative. It's sort of the why not hat. It's optimistic. It sees the opportunities in situation. It looks for benefits and best case scenarios, and it's open to exploring the unknown. The yellow hat asks questions like, what ideas, suggestions, or proposals are there for how to approach this issue? What is the value or benefit in how this plan has been designed? What positives do you see? What could be done to make this more effective? Under what conditions will this work? What is your vision for how this can move forward? So this hat is constructive. It's positive. The green hat is the hat of new ideas, concepts, or perceptions. It is a deliberate creation of new ideas. It's concerned with alternatives and more alternatives. So it looks for new approaches to problems. It is creative and it is concerned with the lateral thinking. So how can we move up from here? So this is the hat of innovation, the green hat. This hat is the one that says, okay, let's think outside the box. What are some fresh approaches or ideas? This is the one that's the crazy hair idea, or the notice how even in the graphic, the hat's turned upside down. What are our alternatives? How can we reshape a certain idea? This one says, we've always done it this way. The green hat says, how else can we do it? Oftentimes the green hat, without even knowing, consciously maybe doing so, it looks at the ways that things have always been done and it immediately dismisses those. And it's looking for new and different ways to look at things, do things. This one is the true paradigm shift hat. The black hat is the cautious hat. This one is careful. It's concerned with judging the situation as it is. This one is considered the logical negative. It has to look at why things won't work or why they haven't worked. It is critical. It is pessimistic. It separates logical negative from emotional. It focuses on errors, evidence, conclusion, basically where things have gone wrong. It's logical and truthful, but notice this one, it is not necessarily fair. So when we're talking about stakeholders, it is not necessarily going to be fair in the way that it imposes judgment on all stakeholders or all solutions. The black hat questions are, what will happen if we take this action? What can go wrong if we proceed with this idea or implement this suggestion? What are the weaknesses that we need to overcome? What is the worst case scenario? Why won't this work? So the black hat is considered that very cautious reasoning hat. So quick summary of the hats. Blue is control and organization. White is objective facts and figures. Red is emotions and feelings. Yellow is that hope, positive, speculation. Green is creativity, ideas, out of the box thinking. And black is that cautious and careful thinking. So this is provided for you, this little worksheet. It's also, I'll put it as a PDF on the Moodle site. I recommend that you look at this along with the video that I've provided that can be one of your observation hours, so that you can understand the way that these hats work in a discussion among students and how they can either generate their own questions or answer questions that have been composed looking through these multiple perspectives. So when we are talking about class discussions and how to implement the hats, this kind of gives you a little idea for how to do it. You could ask for responses and ideas for each focus separately. So like this could be a whole class project, and you hold up each hat and you get the class as a whole to generate ideas or questions that would be associated with that type of thinking hat. You could split the class into groups with different focuses and have them generate ideas that are associated with that type of thinking within a small group. You could have volunteers provide focus when contributing. So for example, let's say that you had a thinking hats discussion about a particular text or maybe even a lab scenario or something. Well, you could have students think about their ideas, but as they are contributing their ideas, they have to identify which one of the hats it most fully represents. And that way students are able to critically think and apply their learning, but they're also able to use those multiple perspectives when articulating their ideas. And then another way is if we split the class into groups, the groups have the same focus, but within each group, we've actually made each member of the group wear, so to speak, one of these thinking hats, and they are responsible for contributing that level of engagement. This one is the most dependent on the students really knowing and understanding the way the thinking hats work. It probably would not be the best way to start with thinking hats. If you kind of see, it would be better to start whole class, and up here in the top left, then I would recommend maybe doing volunteers to provide and let them identify. And that way you could provide formative feedback about, no, this isn't really a white hat idea. It's actually a green hat idea. And you could kind of give some feedback. Then you could split them up into groups and let them really dig deep into one type of the thinking before sharing out their ideas whole class. And then lastly, I think that they would be ready then to function independently with one of those thinking hats within a group. We pulled from several different sources for this lecture, but these give you this gives you an idea of the dominant sources that we used. And we just want to say that eliciting student thinking is one of the most profound ways to engage students in the learning process and to give them agency in their own learning. And we are responsible as practitioners in our classrooms for equitable instructional practices to give all students opportunities to critically think about content and build their own critical thinking skills. So we really sell ourselves short, we sell our classrooms short, and we sell our students short when we do not elicit their thinking and help them build their critical thinking. If you have any questions, please reach out and let me know. Once again, this is Lori Benoit, and I am delivering the lecture this time. Dr. Williams and I created this together, but please let me know if you have any questions. Shoot me an email and I'll be happy to get back with you. This lecture is going to be the foundation for what you're going to see on Moodle. You've got some resources that you still need to look at. We've got some observation and field experience videos you're going to need to apply these concepts to. And we also have an activity with a discussion board. So this is the foundation that allows you to dig deep into the activities.